Welcome to episode 5. I'm back with my partner in crime, Baron Short. Hey, Baron. Hello, hello.
Good to see you, Gregg. Happy to be back.
Excited
Happy to talk and explore together as our Mindedness revolution.
That's right, man.
And there is that plug, right, that we put out there that at some point people are going to go, wow, this is as big as that the sun is not actually going around the earth, that the earth is going around the sun. So we'll get you there.
Right. We're shooting broad, right, at this juncture. We'll see where people are, but that is the arc of what we're headed and what we're advertising ultimately. And you can plug in, we did Mindedness last time into the territory, and we're here to say that I don't have a good framework for describing mind. Mindedness is a super crucial thing. It bridges our behaviors from living organisms up into animals, and that situates us so that we can also get subjectivity in there. That's mind 2. And then talking recursively on that, that's mind 3, either privately or publicly. So that's that map of mind. It plugs in the tree of knowledge, gives us a map of the terrain of mindedness. We covered that last time. That points to these things, right? But it sort of describes them and says, oh, okay, that's where the domain is, if you're just pointing to them. Don't really say why those things operate the way that they do. And that's what I'd like us to talk about today. And really just so folks are set up, I'm laying sort of the groundwork, and then you're going to take the baton and walk us forward into sort of like, what does it really mean? Okay, Gregg, your theory, great. This matters to people's lives, believe it or not. You say it does, but can we make that happen? That's your task, Baron. I say it matters, and you actually make that real.
We'll make it matter.
It matter. But in the meantime, we have one more thing to say from sort of a guided UTOK perspective, and that is sort of put some meat on the bones of this map of mind structure, and in particular, this kind of mind 2 to mind 3. So just let's remind ourselves, what's mind 2? That's from the inside out. That's your felt experience of being. The fact that you close your eyes, you open your eyes, you have this flood of experience. The nature of mind 2 is it's hard to see from the outside. Try to get somebody else, hey, there's your blue shirt. How do you know that I see the blue? Because it's very hard to see, but it's super easy for me to see. Mind 2 is inside out. Then mind 3 is this justifying mind. And now I threw that word in intentionally. If you're familiar with UTOK, you know the word, but we're going to now describe first mind 3, we'll come back to mind 2, and its components, and the key $64,000 word here, according to UTOK's justification. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what is this? Well, the idea, actually UTOK's first key idea in all of its history back in 1996 is this idea. Now, virtually everyone who kind of looks at human behavior is like, well, we talk, right? That's whatever that is exactly. We symbolize, we reason. These are all, we're the rational animal, to use. This is, if you Rene Descartes, I can reason. That makes us very different. But exactly where and how that jump happened remains, a bit ambiguous. I think language is anchored there, and then collective intelligence, and then our ability to coordinate ourselves non-verbally, like if you look at Tomasello. Well, UTOK says, hey, actually what really happened was symbols got tagged, and then they got organized into syntax, which is a proposition, and then that conveyed a positive meaning, like antelope there is the example I always use, and then wait, there are the antelope, okay? Well, there are the antelopes, proposition. Proposition means there's a positive meaning, assertion, and guess what, folks, when you get that, you can challenge it, okay? Mm-hmm. And the argument is that the propositions quickly give rise to questions, which is the cognitive process of doing a counterfactual, like how do you know those are antelope? How do you know they're over there? And even should you challenge it from a value perspective, maybe that's not relevant. Maybe we should talk about fire or rabbits or something else. And this challenge of this creates a generative dynamic called the problem of justification, which are what good answers that legitimize our behavior. And if you're a parent, I like to say, and you've raised kids, it actually isn't always clear, although you can assert dominance, it isn't always clear when they say why, that you have good justifications. You sort of just say, hey, sometimes that's the way it is, and I'll assert my dominance. But the point of it is that there's a tipping point in the nature of propositions, gives rise to question and answer dynamics. That gives rise to problem of justification. And it is this generative problem of how do you justify that really creates a whole complexity building feedback loop. Okay. And that strain of mind, which we call mind 3 because it's a different kind of information processing system. It's even got a different epistemology, meaning it's intersubjective propositional, meaning we know about it through propositions and we can gain access to it across subjects. It's this building of justifications. And I'm not going to get into all the details of this, but it's cool because it makes a set of claims. If what's called reverse engineer, if that was the case, then this should be the case. And it says your ego should be a justifying mind. Okay. And it says the nature of justification, because actually it's coming off of yourself as a primate, investing animal in a primate, it should be very attuned to context and the audience that you're justifying to. Okay. So the function of justification is to legitimize. You're going to legitimize to whatever the audience is. And that means different audiences will drive different justifications and different justification processes. And now this says you have an audience to yourself subjectively, because that subjective stuff really is shit you have access to that other people don't. And then you have audience to other. Okay. And that's a different kind of problem, although they're obviously related. But what it says is that your self-conscious system will be kind of Janus-faced. A Janus-face means it faces outward and faces inward. Okay. The outward facing is your persona. We borrow a term from Jung and say, hey, you got to manage your impressions. Okay. Our Goffman, a famous sociologist, micro-level sociologist, say, what do you really do? Well, it's like you manage a stage and you manage your role and impression in the micro-relational world. And if you doubt that, next time somebody spreads a rumor about your reputation and lies about you, you see if you care. Whether somebody lies and, oh, Barron, he's a complete lying asshole. And now all your friends start to talk about you and that way. My guess is that, oh my God, no way is that okay. I need to get in there and manage that. Why? Because you're a living primate and you care about the world, as you should. At one level we can get into values, but that's the reality. So managing the outside world is one problem. And then you have this feeling system, right? This primate feeling system that sees the world and then feels about it. It has thirst. It has needs for belonging. It connects to the world. And then you have to justify to that. And that's your ego. Okay? And this, by the way, is going to be mind 3B, at least when it's private. 3A when it's private. And it's structured to a justified state of being to the ego. And then you have to create a justified state of being to the other, to the social world. And of course, this will depend on relationships. Okay. Here's another example. Your authoritarian boss yells at you, okay, and says you didn't do a good job. There's one context of justification, and then you go home and you talk to your wife about it. See what you say to your boss when he's there and pissed, and see what you say about your boss to your wife at night. Different contexts of justification, and you'll be flooded with what you actually publicly say relative to what you hide, and how you say it will be quite different in those contexts. So there's the nutshell analysis of this mind 3. We're going to divide it up into exterior and interior kinds of domains. We're going to say one's an ego, it tries to justify to self. The other, justify to other, that's your persona. And this whole dynamic is justification, which is a tricky word, but basically it means networking proposition together to make sense about what is and what ought to be to an audience, in this case to the self or to other. I'll pause there and see if you want to jump in on any of that.
Yeah, so this is great, Greg. I'm going to reflect back some elements of what we're talking about. So one would be just that zooming out about the map of mind, and it's this mind 1 being kind of more of the neurocognitive processes, and we talked about that more so last time. And now we're talking about mind 2 and 3 and some of the meat on the bones of this thing, right? And mind 2, in a very simple way, is there's seeing, there's hearing, there's feeling occurring. You don't have to try. There is a type of, as you just, I believe I heard you say, kind of core self or primate heart, I think actually.
That. Yep, exactly.
Right, so we'll talk more about those types
that
of
in a
self.
second.
Yeah, and then at this mind 3 level, that there's this essentially a justification process that creates a private and a public identity, as you said, a Janus face. And hopefully our folks listening and watching can kind of identify with that. And I even will say with students, I'll say, think about some of the things I talk about as I'm teaching you. Even if you disagree, you're probably not going to say much because there's a social structure of justification that says, don't talk back to your teacher. Okay. But if your spouse was saying the same thing or a friend, you would treat them all very differently. And that dynamic of your public persona will change by the context and the justification context. And in that sense, right, in a healthy way, you want to adapt your persona based on the context, and how much of your ego, your private self, leaks out
Totally.
will vary based on that context and what the
Beautiful.
context can handle.
Right.
The other thing I would highlight as you're talking about justifications, I think sometimes that could be a hard thing for some people to grasp.
Yep.
I almost think of it as like a way I reframe it is like, if we were fish and we're swimming in water,
Right.
and then somebody said, and we're saying, where's the justification? Is like saying, where is the water?
Totally.
And you'd say, it's all around us, my friend.
That's
and
right.
so we are embedded in these justification systems at a macro level, right? It's like our actual culture, and says, like if I'm at, and it can be about big things like how do you govern a society, to little things like how you eat food, right? So when
Yep.
I'm in Japan and I eat some food and slurp my noodles, that's the right thing to do. And when I'm at home and my family hate extra sounds when they're eating and I slurp noodles, they say that's quite rude, right? Well, which one's right? Well, it depends on the justification context, right?
Totally.
And so, yeah, it's we're swimming in it.
Yep.
So the way I would, the other thing I would say to people is like, we're shifting for at least momentarily, rather than just looking at the content of words and thoughts, but the context, like what is thought and words doing in us and between us, right? And around us, right?
That's
like
right.
we can make a justification system and say, let's make that's how pyramids are built, right? Or big building, like we're going to justify why we need to put this immense amount of time and labor and expense and energy, right? So
Totally.
it's a superpower, like in a way, right? That it's in us and between us and around us, and perhaps to engage that, being able to not just look at the content of what we're saying, but the context matters, right?
Completely.
The mind matters,
Beautiful.
and justification matters. Yeah.
Yep. Exactly. So if we layer this up a little bit, you're right. The context, and in fact, we build these systems of justification. And I like to say we can think contemporaneously. If you're born in Saudi Arabia today versus Canada, and think about, say, gender roles, like what are men and women ought to be, very different systems of justification there. You go back, if you were born in an oral indigenous culture 20,000 years ago on the plain, they would have been talking, but they would have had very different ways of explaining what nature was and how you relate to the world. And you would be socialized into that. Sociologists, anthropologists call this the social construction of reality. What is being constructed? Well, I just add the term, these bricks are the content, okay? But then they create this context that you're pointing to. We can also talk about things like processes of justification. Okay, like the ways in which you go about doing it, and whether what's implicit and what's explicit. This word goes all the way from Plato and philosophy. Like, oh my gosh, Einstein's totally justified in making this because of the empirical evidence that we now have for general relativity. That's as refined a claim. That guy who was he justified beating his wife because she annoyed him, right? Well, that's a rationalizing, or that's a weak. Notice the same term goes all the way. That's not to say that they're equivalent at the level of validity. Indeed, this is what that's about. But at the level of sort of content dynamic process, there's an equivalency there, or a type equivalency, not necessarily at the level of epistemological justification, of course. But that's the point: is that this concept takes you, and it really turns talking and reasoning and symbolic use and culture, it binds it all together. And it also allows you to see yourself Okay? Like, what are we doing, Baron, when we say, oh my gosh, it's like Copernicus. We're justifying, right? we're legitimizing. We found something over here. Come over to look. It's going to be awesome. Yeah. You know, we believe in it. We value it. That's a justification for what we're justifying. So it's everywhere. And I love the fish example.
I'm using that as a justification as a hook, right? I'm hoping people will say, either call bullshit on that or they're excited to hear when we get there, right?
Totally.
This is
exactly.
But there's
and all of a sudden, right? So legitimizing. So it's legitimize self, legitimize another. You put it in a relational context. Legitimize your wife. Legitimize to your teacher, and then recognize that there's a society has its evolution of technology. But what binds society? Laws. What are laws? They're formal systems of justification. My brother's a lawyer. When I was doing this, I was like, you know what you are? You're a professional justifier. It's like, actually, yeah, that is what I do, right? I underform the formal sort of lawful algorithms, and then what's the precedent, and then I argue, and I have expertise in that. So anyways, it's all over the place. It's a really, really
I'm going to riff off
thing.
that a second, if it's okay. So so how that goes at the public level and the private level. So just as you said, law is a system of justification. You've said and written about how science is a system of justification, right? Like enough people got together and said, my experience can be inaccurate. I can bias myself, and so can you. So how can we continue to refine our epistemology, how we're going to know what we know, and try to remove as many variants and variables as possible? And so I think you have a beautiful way of talking about that gives a middle way from science is absolute truth to science is just a social construction, just like me saying words, to say, no, it's not absolutely true. And it's not just another social thing, right? It's like a very refined epistemology. And so that's at a private high level, but then at the public level, right? And in our day-to-day where we may work with people, right? Or our own self, right? So if I have something bad happen at work, first pass, if I come home and I have somebody like my wife to talk with, I'm going to talk about it. And then if in an unexamined way, what I will likely quickly do is look for my wife to justify why I said or did what I did. And that's what most of us do most of the time, right? It's just being human. The more advanced level is people are actually looking and saying, this is what I said and did, but was it accurate? And it's a rarer individual that says, I know I BS myself sometimes, right, and I need some people to trust to be a mirror, right? A good therapist can be that way, a good family member, a good friend. And if you have those people in your life, like hold on to them, because that's a real gift, right? But most of the time we don't want to challenge our justifications. Back to some of, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but back to work you did with, what was it, Aaron Beck, I think, and some of the cognitive therapy. Sure. Part of cognitive therapy, they don't necessarily say justification, but they're basically saying there's a way you think about things, and that's kind of like a meaning or an interpretation. It's not necessarily the fact, right? There's the fact and then this interpretive layer. And let's look at that interpretive layer because it may not be accurate. And a great example, say in major depression, where people might look at how everything's so bad, right? And say, I'm a total failure. And so we go, wait a minute, you're so good that you've truly failed at everything you've done. Well, maybe not that much, right? So you start, okay, so you've not failed at everything. That's actually not what you mean, but your system, you will believe it, right? So if mind 3 is saying I'm a total failure, you start to mind 2 feel it, and then your mind 1 starts to shut down, behavioral shut down more. Right. So you can, and that's a beautiful way of how a mind 3 intervention can work its way down. Right. Or a mind 1 intervention could help the system be more flexible at a mind 3 level.
That's lovely. That's lovely. And so, so we want this mind 3. We can structurally, functionally look at it. It's propositionally mediated, and then it's organized into these systems of justification that nest at the ego, individual level, at small group levels, all the way up into societal level identities. Like Christianity is a large-scale system. Science is a large-scale, different kind, but they're all large-scale systems that coordinate people. And with that, understanding, then I do want to drop in very briefly, come back to mind two, okay? Because the model of human consciousness that we are operating from, model of mind two into mind three, we already now talked about mind three. Well, what is mind two from a phenomenological side? I want to say that you operate in a field of subjective awareness. In fact, when we say you empirically experience something, and we don't mean that, then is that scientifically? Well, from the individual observer, you observe something. It comes onto your field of potential awareness, and then you direct your attention, you experience it, then become aware that you experience it. Okay? And I want to then suggest that this is something we share with primates. If we go to the brain, we say the brainstem needs to be on, you need to be awake, it turns on the system. And then it organizes sort of I'm going to use an old term, limbic system, okay? And then thalamus, which is really this relay center, starts sending signals and creates recursive loops to both the frontal lobe, part of your cortex, and the backside. In particular, there's parietal tertiary areas that are really involved. So we can track this, and this gives you your field of experience. When you dream, you wake up and you remember, it's like, oh, I was playing in that field. Right? That's what dreaming is. So this is that mind two experience. And I want to then, for our purposes, I want to divide it up into two kind of domains. There is a sensation perception into domain, which is sort of like the screen of presenting you. If you close your eyes, open your eyes, right? And with very little work, your system brings that and presents it to you. Okay? We call that sort of pure awareness. And you are more advanced in mindfulness stuff than I am, and you can attest to this in your studies. That focus on what that is, the East has done a lot of cool stuff to say, actually, that's a pathway, that pure awareness pathway through meditation, focused on awareness, focused on the intentional mechanisms of that awareness. And a lot of the messaging there is actually let go of the self, let go of the ego, the narrator, let go of the attachments, okay? The world of psychotherapy has been a little different. It's been like, how do we hold this set of ego, and how do we get it adaptively regulating and relating? One is this ego, this justifier. In fact, that's what cognitive therapy really is about, in my estimation. It really should be called justification therapy, okay? Because it really is about the self-talk, its accuracy, its adaptiveness, how you interpret, how you attribute, and the consequences of that. And then there are other approaches, like experiential approaches, therapy or emotion focus. They get right at your feeling gut. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what that is. As an animal that can extend itself through time, we have models of ourselves in relating to the world in general. As social mammals, we have it relating to other people. And we carry this relational system around in us, and it says, oh, Greg, this is what's relevant to you. Okay, and when I was born, I was prepared to track my mom a particular way, in particular, all caregivers. And thankfully, I had a pretty good attachment there. So I was actually a secure baby. And I had then a sense that together, my mom and I would be safe and protected. If I got upset, she would be available to me, and then regulated my independence from her over a course of a developmental process. Well, all that's not here because I was 6 months old, I mean, justifying. All of that's in my primate self. So I have this map of myself that goes all the way back. If we do psychodynamic work, meaning like Freudian self, I want to get to this core. How does this person, as a young primate, vulnerable primate, relate to mom? How does she separate from mom? What are all those dynamics? And how does that set the stage for how they relate to people? Well, that's your core experiential self. Okay. And really what you're trying to do often is you're trying to justify to that or justify at it from an ego place.
Yes.
Because you can internalize an authority and try to say, grow up or wake up or do all these things. The little primate child, and you're like, oh, wow, that really hurts. And then temper tantrum, screw you, or gets all depressed and shamed. And we could talk about that. But fundamentally, the point of it is that you have this primate heart, this feeling system, and it wants to be held, it wants to be respected, it wants to grow in particular ways. It's an embodied see, hear, feel network that then has reactions to the world and guides you towards certain things. It's not through language, it's through embodiment as a primate. So your core self then is that element, your ego's narrating that, and your sense of self is really the dynamic relation as an adult, the story you tell yourself, how you justify and how you feel. it's pulling in, creating screens of understanding, and the mind two, at least, is responding. Mind one's even before that, but mind two is responding to those screens, building what's called episodic memory of them, relating to them, and projecting out into the future. And of course, on the social stage, you got to regulate both your actions and your narrative in relationship to that. So persona is out here, justify to others. Ego, justify to self. The core self's that primate heart. And it also has access to awareness through that. And those four vectors, awareness, the core experiential self, that ego, and persona, those are really good. They build from the mind, map of mind, but then they flesh on, you're justifying ego, justifying to other persona, your core primate self, which is born as an attachment system and then regulates, and you have a sensory perceptual awareness system. Those are four vectors that we wanted to sort of like flesh out the map of mind that we introduced earlier and give you a sense of your own phenomenology, because now we can start to think about, how do we work with all this?
Oh, that's beautiful, Greg. Yeah, I think that is the take home, probably two level of for folks not in, mental health or psychiatric sciences. How do you upgrade your folk psychology and look at these different layers of self, but also within the field, right? Which we will get more into there needs to be ideally better meta-theoretical integration. And what you're kind of discussing and justifying is a better, more comprehensive map of like, people can actually understand ego persona, right? If you really reflect on that and how you behave in a certain way, but how you feel inside. I can give a great example. I could occasionally see very depressed people that are laughing and smiling. And I ask them, and they're coming to me for brain stimulation treatments. And I go, why are you laughing and smiling? I thought you were really depressed. And then the ego comes online because they've had a persona to pretend they're okay. And the ego comes online and they start bawling, crying, and all the pain is there, right? They were hiding it from me too.
Smiling
right?
depression. Smiling depression sometimes.
That's it. Meanwhile, they're thinking of killing themselves, right? It's like really a big difference. So like learning from one view, how do we cultivate healthier adaptive personas? How do we cultivate, healthier adaptive egos? Part of, I would say, in my own journey is like allowing more of my ego to integrate into more of my personas and taking my ego and looking at the stuff I've was ashamed of or embarrassed of and learning to integrate that so I can heal within, right? Yeah. And then if I can do that and we can do that, then we show up in the world very differently. And then that layer below, right, as you said, this core experiential self, wow, if we don't connect with that, we just won't feel right. And in fact, we will try to justify, well, I should feel different. The critic comes out, right? I should feel better. And if you reflect on it, whose voice is that? It's somebody you know, maybe somebody you were raised you, right? Totally. We know that voice, right? And so learning to language, to identify these features can truly, in my view, be a game changer for people. And so that's a big one that if you get it, it's hard to unsee it. The other is about justification itself, right? If you actually realize this huge world we live in, the human social world and the world of justifications, wow, it'll blow your mind. Like just even the difference is something like money, right? So we can say functionally, here's money. And we think of it as this concrete thing, even though it's becoming more digitized. And then that's the functional part. But if we actually looked at the ontological or what is it really real, it's literally an agreement that a lot of people made before any of us were alive that says, here's a form of exchange. And then they further just abstracted what that was, right? If we actually look at what it is, right? And so you could, exactly right. If you're that kind of mind, you may want to just look around and look at all the justifications, including rules that we make and say, not all rules are just. They are justified. They may not be just, right? Slavery at one point was legal. It was justified, but not just, right? And so to ride that edge in our own society, right? To say I can look at the justifications, but let's perhaps evaluate those and say, what could handle an upgrade? What do we keep, right? What needs to be conserved, and what do we need to upgrade? So,
I love it. Those are exactly the kind of reflections, and so now we put now mind 3 is then organized by this, and then mind 2, it's got an awareness structure and this feeling structure, primate heart, and that's all then embedded in a brain behavior relational mind 1. Which then is embedded in a living organism, then embedded in a material object on an energy information field. That's the extended. And now we can kind of go inside and out. The argument is, yes, we have this mind 2. That's weird. It's really where the hard problem is. But I think we boxed it in and give it a pretty good framework. And certainly all the concept of mindedness is now binding this together. And that bind is about ready to get extended, okay? Because now one of the things about mind, as John Vervaeke will talk, is recursive. Okay, we get recursive on what's going on. In fact, mind 2 is sort of a model of mind 1, and then mind 3 is narrating and modeling mind 2. So that suggests that is there a way we can step out and see this whole thing and wonder about our justifications, wonder about our experiences, wonder about who we are. I think about ready to make a jump into that maybe in our next episode.
That's right. That's right. To think that, the naivety to say that this is it, that, we can't go any further. I think that's what we certainly want to justify otherwise. Right. Definitely. And I would actually argue that as we will get closer into a mind 4, it takes a type of mind 4 to look at the narration of mind 3 and the phenomenology of a mind 2, or I don't think, I think that's important in there as well. So, more to come for sure.
All right. So there's our theory of human consciousness. In terms of extending, I did want to just say really quickly, we call that actually the updated tripartite model. And that's a direct reference to Freud, which is the id, which is then like your animal self, your ego, your internal. He called the superego, but really better framed by Jung's persona, I argue, blah, blah, blah. But it's that psychodynamic model put in a modern context, supported by a huge amount of data in cognitive social psychology, I would argue, and accessible to our everyday. Look and see, hey, we're justifiers and we're feelers as primates that we see here and feel, react, have motives. So there's your mind 2, mind 3 relation, theoretically enriched. And now let's move forward and see where the next step is on how to reflect on this. All right, friend.
Awesome. Super great. Fun. All right.